years ago, if you sat in front of a computer, this is what you would see. A blinking cursor waiting patiently for you to tell it what to do. If you wanted to see your files, you would type ls for list, and then it would show you your files like this. They'd all look the same, even though some might be text, some might be images. But now, if you want to see your files, you just open up the folder and you look. And you can see some are text, some are images, because they look that way. If you wanted to move a file from one folder to another, you would type mv for move, the name of the file, isaacsbio.doc, and then something like ... talks, which is the location of the destination folder, local, relative to the current folder. Now, you drag the file from one folder to another. We take this visual display of our files and folders for granted, but somebody had to think of that. At a time when everybody who used computers typed those kinds of cryptic commands, somebody had to first notice that this wasn't so easy, and second, think of a better way to do it. Someone had to think that you could draw little pictures of files and folders on the screen and manipulate them by dragging a little box around on the tabletop. Well, those people were Doug Engelbart and Alan Kay. Engelbart invented the mouse, and Kay invented what's called graphical user interfaces. At the time, Alan Kay worked at Xerox PARC in California, which is where I work today. And in 1971, he said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that's what he did. So this was at a time when computers looked like this. Giant boxes of technology in big rooms hooked up to these terminals, which is where you type those commands. They were very expensive, so you had to share them, and people would sign up for time on the computer. So it's not surprising that at a time like this, Ken Olsen, the head of a very big computer company called Digital, said, there's no way anyone would want a computer in the home. Somebody had to think that you could take all that technology and compress it into a little box that would sit on the desktop and that would be dedicated to just one person's use. So that's something we all take for granted now, but at the time, that would be extravagant. Well, those people worked at Xerox PARC, and in 1973, they invented the Alto, the first graphical personal computer. And that led to the Apple Macintosh, the IBM PC, and now all the slick desktop, laptop, and tablet computers that we all use today. So we're here today talking about the best of what Broadway can be. And I think that the reason that I was invited here is that the organizers were hoping that some of that magic from the early park scientists is still lingering in the halls where I work, revealing to me a vision of where you will be in 20 years. Well, I'm afraid that hasn't happened. But there is one bit of park magic that I can share with you, and it has to do with a method that you can use to figure it out, called ethnography. So let's go back to the 1980s when a Xerox copier took up an entire room. There was another park scientist, Lucy Suchman, and she had the idea that maybe if you're building technology for people, you should watch them using it. So she decided to watch some people using a Xerox copier. She grabbed a couple of her colleagues from down the hall, and she asked them to make copies. So I'm going to show you a short clip of a video from this historic video of these two people making copies.
Place 1 to 50 originals, but wait a minute, I have 100 originals. Face up. Place all originals against the left wall. We want two-sided copies. Unload top paper tray. Now, do we want them collated? What? Reverse order the originals? You gotta be kidding. This is definitely a bug. Press start.
Does that relate to that?
Unload top paper
We didn't do
tray.
that. That's not this. That's not the paper tray. It doesn't say what the paper tray is, huh? So our first batch
Our first,
is SOL.
what is that?
Should have.
Well, we sure did come up with a lot of paper.
So it turns out that those two people from down the hall are world-renowned computer scientists. One of them went on to win the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in computer science. So clearly the problem is not that the people are dumb, the problem was with the design of the copier. Today, it is now common practice for companies to do what's called usability testing. But back then, it wasn't done. Lucy Suchman had to think of it. And she went further. She realized that you could observe people not just to figure out how to make their products easier to use, but also to figure out what products to build in the first place. So this practice of observing people in their natural environments to understand their needs is called ethnography. At the time, it was an academic practice. It grew out of anthropology. Musi Suchman was the first one to apply it to industry. So even today, not everybody uses ethnography. Most companies will try to understand their customers' needs by asking them directly, using tools like focus groups or surveys. But asking people to tell you what they want gets you only so far. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead said, what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. When people do their jobs or just any ordinary activity, much of what you do just becomes invisible to you. It's just what you do. But if you watch people, you start to realize a lot of times people are working around their tools. And it's these gaps or problems people work around that are opportunities for innovation. The thing is, a lot of times when you point them out to people, they'll say, well, sure, it's obvious that's a problem. But they don't think to tell you about it when you ask. To notice it, you have to get out and watch. So I like to think of my job as an ethnographer like this. You sit and you watch the chaos that is human behavior. And if you're patient and you watch for a while and you have a naive state of mind, you start to notice insights that are obvious after you point them out. You start to notice the hidden obvious. Well, how does this work? What is ethnography like? Well, let me give you two examples from my work. So the last couple of years, I've been studying parking. Now, I realize parking is an odd place to go looking for technology opportunities. But we all know, New Yorkers especially, that parking is an area where there's a lot of problems and a lot of needs not being met. So to study parking, my colleagues and I have spent a lot of time hanging around on street corners, watching cars parking, trucks unloading, enforcement officers giving tickets, and we've seen a lot of things you might expect and some that you might not. So one of the things that we started to notice gradually was the parking signs and how difficult it can be to tell the one thing you want to know quickly, can I park here now, in the few seconds you have as you're driving by. So I'm going to show you a sign for about that amount of time, and I want you to figure out, can you park here now? Let's say it's Wednesday, early in the morning, it's 7 a.m. Can you park here now? Okay, let's look again. Okay, this is hard not just because there's so much going on, but you'll notice that Wednesday is not mentioned and 7 a.m. is not in any of the time ranges. So you have to infer that because it's not covered, you can park here, at least to the left of the signs. Okay, here's another one. It's 3 p.m. Can you stop here now? Okay, let's look again. So the bottom sign says no parking at 3 p.m. So that implies that you can stop. And the top, no stopping sign, doesn't cover 3 p.m. So that implies, again, you have to figure out that you can stop here. Okay, and here's one more where I challenge you to figure out what you can do here at any time. So the problem here is that parking signs focus on restrictions. Know this, know that, when what you want to know is what you can do. Now, when I say it like this, it seems obvious. But when you ask people to tell you what are some of your problems you have with parking, they generally don't go complaining and saying, you know, parking signs are difficult to read quickly as you drive by because they focus on restrictions. To really understand this, you have to get out and watch. And it can take a while. Because we were looking at so many different aspects of parking, the signs didn't really come into focus for us until the fourth city and over 1,000 photos and videos. Once we noticed it, it was obvious. So what could you do about this? Well, one thing you could do is redesign the signs. And so here's one possible way you could design that second sign. And it's on the right, you see it's organized by time of day, from morning through night. So at any time you can find now, and then you can just look to the right and see, can I park? Green, yes. Red, no. Orange, there's some kind of restriction. Like here, it's deliveries only. And if you want to be kind to internationals, you could include symbols. Okay, so that's one example of how ethnography found an unmet need. Let me give you another one. So we noticed a lot of times when we were out looking that there were a lot of loading zones marked by yellow curbs that weren't being used. Here we are looking for a parking spot, and it's just loading as far as the eye can see, and not very many trucks using it, and yet we can't park. On the other hand, we saw a lot of times when trucks were trying to make deliveries and couldn't find a loading zone. And since they have to park near where they're going to be delivering, they get creative. So they double park, and they block in cars, both diagonal and parallel. They park in the median, blocking cars from turning left. They park in the crosswalk, blocking people from crossing the street. And they park on the sidewalk. So the problem here is that loading zones take up precious parking resources, and yet they don't really meet the need. Again, I point this out, seems obvious, but when we talk to people about their parking problems, they don't say loading zones are inefficient, they say there's not enough parking. So what can you do about this? Well, what you really like to do is to have the spots for loading when they're needed and then make them available to everyone else when they're not. So this is something we're doing right now. We have built a prototype parking meter that can change its state from parking to loading, no parking in other states. And since trucks have GPSs, they have GPSs and they know where they're going, we can take a spot and change it from parking to loading, and then when they come and they park, they can put it back to parking. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Broadway? Well, what I'm trying to say is that, well, I don't know what you need to do to make Broadway the best it can be. You can get some ideas by using ethnography. It's a very general tool. We've used it in many different domains: hospitals, nursing, call centers, retail stores, young people using mobile devices, lots more, and you could use it on Broadway. So you could accompany a family as they're spending a day out on Broadway. Or you could watch someone as they're planning a day or an evening for a night out and a show. Or you could just hang out at the tickets booth and watch people buying tickets, or people checking into hotels, or people choosing a restaurant, or window shopping, or going to a show, all those things. And maybe if you're patient and you do it for a while and you keep a naive state of mind, maybe you will discover the hidden obvious. Maybe you'll be the one to think of a novel idea that people will take for granted in 20 years. Thank you.